Hey, Tim.
Hey, hey.
Super excited for this one.
Oh, yes. No, it should be fun.
So, got to get my screen organized. I have Dan Smith's paper on Deleuze open, and I have Mike's paper on Platonic morphospace open, and my notes. So much to
Cool.
say. Um,
Yeah.
well, so much on my mind that I'm not even sure I know how to say yet, but hopefully we can untangle it together. Uh,
Oh no, Matt, I completely rely on you, and we're going to start in a Platonic register to be the statesman, to be
okay.
to be the helmsman, so to be the kybernectes, right? So we'll tie it to cybernetics straight away. I
Mhm.
rely on you to guide the conversation because I assume that your notes are always vastly better organized than mine because mine are completely all over the place about this. Yeah.
We all have our methods. Um, we maybe we'll try to discover what the true madness uh, of philosophy is in the process of sorting out all of this. The return of Platonism to biology, even if it's an inverted Platonism, it seems very much like there's an increased appreciation for the problem of form and how we cannot explain it in terms of um, uh, simply located material parts. And we can't explain it in terms of maybe even uh, we can't explain it in terms of just biochemistry, the laws of biochemistry. That there seems to be laws, different kinds of laws operating at other scales, and maybe even other layers of reality that are not physical, according to Mike Levin. Um, but before we get into the details, I think it'd be helpful to just talk about the relationship between philosophy and science.
Hmm. Sure.
And first of all, to just the reason to say I'm so excited about this is that you know Mike Levin, who you were just in conversation with, what, a few days ago, uh,
Yesterday.
with that the Platonist philosopher um,
Robert Printner. Yeah, that was just yesterday. So that's just
yesterday.
up
So
on
I got to
YouTube.
listen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to listen to a bit of that too, and
Mm.
it's just really lovely to see um, biologists coming to philosophers for help to figure out these things. And of course, you and Mike are both philosophers too. I'm not trying to say um, I am definitely not a scientist, so but to be able to collaborate like this across disciplines is just really exciting, and I think we want to figure some stuff out. But there's also um, I hope, an example that this can set for other researchers to do similar things. And because there's so many scientists who speak in the popular, into popular culture who disparage philosophy. I think that's the norm often. There are a few exceptions, but it seems to be like the norm for philosophers to be told to take a back seat, or philosophy as such, even these questions, scientists, um, famously like Neil deGrasse Tyson, um, and others. Was it Wheeler who said that um, philosophy of science is just as interesting to scientists as ornithology is to birds?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that
I'm
was
glad to
Wheeler.
see we're bucking that trend.
Mm.
If it is a trend, maybe it's already shifting at a wider scale, and this is just an example of that. But anyways, I feel like
Can I give there's a
please.
little Simondon quote. It's actually quoted. It's not in one of his published works that I'm aware of, but it was quoted by his daughter in her biography of him. And he says, at the level of method, science is in no way the sovereign of a vassal-like philosophy. Their relation, rather, is that of the spontaneous to the reflective. The spontaneous only governs the reflective, as in scientism, when the reflecting activity has not been contemporaneous with the spontaneous activity. So he's kind of saying that, like, if philosophy doesn't keep up with science,
Yeah.
then this is what's going to happen. Like science is going to assume this sovereign-like role.
Yeah.
Uh, but if the things are working in parallel, it doesn't work that way. And this is an ancient sort of well, not it can't be that ancient, I suppose, because the distinction between science, as we understand that in the modern era, and philosophy is a very modern concept. But I mean, it's at least as old as that, right? That there's as these things start to, and of course the science versus theology, and the sense in which the scientific movement is in fact a reactionary, budding off from a particular, main stem of theology and natural philosophy. And as we get into Plato, we're of course always already talking about the interaction between theology and natural philosophy as though those are two distinct things, right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I thought that Simondon quote was a nice way to just sort of reinforce what you're saying.
I think philosophers like Simondon and Whitehead and Bergson
Yeah.
are earlier in the 20th century trying to help scientists catch up to the philosophical implications of their own discoveries,
Yeah, I think
right?
that's right. Yeah.
Um, that a movement to an understanding of quantum non-locality out of classical physics into an understanding of quantum non-locality and spatio-temporal relativity undermines the mechanical philosophy, at least as it had been understood, um, by Descartes and by 19th century mechanists and scientific materialists. And so, um, but also philosophers must keep up with the continual advance of scientific concepts. And it's hard work, let me tell you.
Yeah, it's exhausting, and it's endless, and that's quite appropriate for those of us that take a kind of processual stance towards reality and knowledge itself.
Mhm.
This is an open-ended process, and so we should always be remind ourselves to kind of check our hubris at the door, in the sense that there's no completion really on offer here. And I think
Right.
you're 100% right about some of these philosophers that we're really enamored of, who are they were reminding science in a way to integrate
Mhm.
across these different domains, and to assess the impact of a novel scientific discovery on the ontology itself. So it's
Mhm.
like, okay, if the world actually looks like this now, well, this seems kind of different from the previous ontology. How in a systematic way is that novel discovery going to feed back onto that ontology? Not in a Okay, there is a principle of locality that I want to uphold in ontology in general, but not just in a localized way. Not that, things do also have to hang together, to kind of
Yeah.
quote both Sellers simultaneously, whatever else we might think of Wilfrid Sellers and his reputation as an eliminativist, which is perhaps overblown in some ways, but also just that very nice pithy way of putting it. The role of philosophy here is to see how things hang together, and then, in exactly as Simondon is saying, you do have to be somewhat cutting edge with the science, because if you're integrating over the science of 100 years ago, whatever,
Yeah.
then how relevant is that integration likely to be to the ongoing progress of science, but really, just to our understanding of life, the universe, and everything, what the nature of reality, blah blah blah.
Right.
Don't be obsolete before you even set pen to paper, and
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's something you said about wanting to defend a kind of locality, and I agree. And I think that's part of this issue when we're thinking through the relationship between the space of quantum possibility, say, and the space of actuality and the canalization of actuality through space-time in the form of what Whitehead calls societies or historical roots. We need to figure out how that transition, if that's the word for it, occurs,
yeah.
or how concrescence occurs, to use another Whitehead term. Um,
Or to bring in what Mike is talking about, and Robert yesterday was referencing interface theory, so Donald Hoffman's ideas, and again, we may have our takes on those things in a broader context, but Mike talking about pointers,
Yeah.
so how some actual system points into and then thus enables the ingression, the Whiteheadian term that he's adopting, of a form. So it points into the latent space, draws something out of it, or this is a relationship of interfacing, right?
Yeah.
And it is a question always of the nature of the horizon of the boundary, and indeed these are at various levels, relatively well-worn questions in the history of philosophy, and its modern attempt to grapple with science.
Right. Yeah. And these interface theories I deeply respect and find perfectly rational in a sense if you follow the implications of information theory and the limitations of what we can know about our environment in any moment. It's hard not to end up in a place like that. But okay, so let's start with, I mean, I want to say something general about Mike's approach here,
Hmm.
that I really, really agree with, and that I find problematic. And the distinction I want to make here is one between cosmology and metaphysics, which you and I have talked about a little bit. And this is how Whitehead makes the distinction, um, where cosmology is about this particular cosmic epoch that has many contingent features which have emerged in the course of history. Um, and we can study that empirically and learn, we can generalize and through induction, gain some knowledge of how a particular cosmic epoch functions. But then there are also these um, metaphysical principles that we might want to search for and be perpetually in search of and never have, we don't want to assume that we've ever arrived. We want to constantly be critical of the idea that we've finally gotten the metaphysical principles. But nonetheless, these ideals are a regulative function for the philosopher, to search for what is the condition for the possibility of any cosmic epoch, or are
Mm.
there any conditions of possibility that we might be able to articulate mathematically or logically? Um, and I think what I would say about Mike Levin's approach, especially in this preprint he just threw up, that's actually going to end up being a chapter in a book on responding to Ian McGilchrist's work, not just his hemisphere hypothesis, but like the larger sort of cosmology and philosophical proposal he's making. Um, so I would say about Mike's approach, cosmologically, I'm fully on board with him. Um, that there are non-physical, as he would refer to them as, or we could even say transphysical agencies. Um, Plato talked about these as like, the animating deities of different spheres um, of the cosmos. The planets and stars and whatnot were deities in the ancient Greek sense. Nowadays, we could just call them organisms, self-organizing, animate beings. And I
We could,
think
we could
Mike,
just do that.
we
Yeah.
could just do that. Yeah, I mean, it's a translation, but this is Mike's panpsychism.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
agree with his panpsychist cosmology. I think it's great. I think we do need to, and by non-physical, I just mean that, there's something like a mental pole, as Whitehead would put it, that's active, not just in the human or the animal or the living realm, but throughout the physical cosmos. There is something like a mental pole that physical science has left out up to this point. And I like that Mike's bringing that back in. Now, metaphysically, though, um, Mike is wanting to attribute agency to these Platonic forms, to these patterns, these possibilities, that they're not just forms that ingress, but intelligences, they're like minds like moving around the space of possibility and I don't know, trying to like push into the actual world. And I think as a metaphysical issue, as a metaphysical, distinction, I I'm compelled by Whitehead's argument that agency lies with actualities, actual occasions in his terms, and not with eternal objects or
Mm,
forms. Who's doing the ingressing? Whitehead would say the actual occasions are deciding what
mm,
to ingress and how to ingress possibility. The possibilities are not deciding.
mm,
Um, and so maybe that's too subtle of a distinction to do
mm.
much helpful work for us. I don't know, but it could do a lot of work for us. It does.
I don't think it's subtle. I don't think it's subtle. I
Okay.
think it's a
Good.
profound, I think it's a profound distinction, and I think it potentially even it's not exactly this, but it's very related to the distinction between a kind of essentially a processual monism and a dualism, like a deep dualistic ontology. And I'm not saying, obviously, I want to avoid that, but I'm not saying that, just because it's dualism, we should avoid it. But I think it creates a bunch of issues that
Well, it's
make,
only a dualism if we don't house the forms in a
yeah,
larger actuality.
yeah,
Not large or small. I mean, it's like I'm talking about the primordial nature or just God, which has the primordial and consequent nature. But in Whitehead's terms, um, the eternal objects aren't just free floating. They're um, prehended by this divine actuality. And
yeah. But
so
so they're always always at their origin in a relationship of reciprocity with an actual.
actuality, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's not it's an
Dualism.
it's an operational dualism, but it's not a metaphysical or really ontological dualism.
Yeah, operational. So to emphasize that it's processual
Yeah,
or operational, I would say it's a dipolarity rather than a duality.
yeah, that's good. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, so I've said a lot. There's this piece of Mike's paper I want to read for us, but I want to give you a chance to, give your impressions of this whole conversation before we get too much
Well,
into.
I don't think I have a sort of prepared synthetic overview. I mean, because I just think there are just so many things to deal with here. And
Yeah,
one of the challenges, and even having a conversation like the one I had yesterday with Mike and Robert, in a relatively short period of time with three people, trying to state your case on such profound philosophical issues,
in an
not to
hour.
well, in an hour with three people, and also without tripping over all of the terminological baggage. Like that's what we're constantly doing here. Because if you say one thing, it seems to imply, all of these, and you're like, no, but I don't mean to imply, and then I get stuck in all of this caveating.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Mike said he was hoping that we could shed some light on, and I think we're going to write a paper with him on kind of philosophical options in terms of the way one might approach. So if we take it as a given that that there is a necessary operation, a necessary functional role, that a kind of latent space of more or less, definite potential is going to play. So if we all agree that we need that, what are the kind of broader ontological options in which we can nest that kind of thing? So we've talked about doing a paper on that, but you know, speaking of terminology, there are hardly any more, baggage-laden terms than Platonism in the history of philosophy, right? And that's one of the reasons why we have to get, drill down quite specifically on what that even means. But then a lot of the terms that get brought up here, and many of them have very traditional usage. God, mind, capital M, mind, perhaps, or maybe nous. Um,
Mm.
and the way those interact with, say, like contemporary versions of panpsychism, which, as we know, you and I've talked about a lot, and you've written a lot about, are themselves notably plural. Um, but how generalizing terms like cognition, like mind, like consciousness, and I mean even like evolution, I'll throw myself in there too. I throw myself under this bus of excessive generalization of terms that have tons of baggage. it's a minefield, and it's difficult to navigate all of those things. And we all have different intuitions about the nature of the baggage that might be pulled along with some of these things. But we're kind of always being, and this is, I mean, this is the philosophical, the burden in a way of doing philosophy at all, is that we're always drawn into this history of false problems, I would say, when we use any of these loaded terms. They all come with this baggage. But on
Yeah.
the cosmology, metaphysics distinction, I do think that's really important. And you reminded me that even Whitehead, subtitles Process and Reality is like an essay in like speculative cosmology, which on the one hand, we can see as evidencing a certain kind of humility on his part, which I think is great. And he has, there's something that you should read, or I can dig it up because you shared it with me again the other day. But at least a section of that part where he talks about discreteness and arithmetic, and whether they
Mm.
are indeed metaphysical. Because this is actually one of my, quite independently of Whitehead, one of my sticking points.
Mm.
So that's something to get to. But I think it really is important in that note to look at both the history of mathematics, in terms of where a lot of the we can even call them the enabling constraints, or like the foundational structures or whatever in mathematics itself actually come from. Because there's a lot of talk about how, well, the mathematical landscape is vastly greater than that, region of it which applies to physics and all that, and that suggests to someone like Max Tegmark that there's this, Platonic realm of mathematics that vastly exceeds the physical and actual. And it's like, well, do the history of math, like engage with the history of mathematics and its connection to the empirical world, and how we got to that, broader mathematical landscape, and maybe be thinking about relationships of adjacency there. So, a lot of things were given to us in a certain sense by the physical actual world. We discovered principles, we abstracted and generalized them, and then we were able to explore a space of adjacency with those principles that really contributes to the sprawling of the mathematical landscape, kind of in the same way that a diffusion model starts with a bunch of discrete data points, injects noise into it, which spreads out into the adjacent possible of those data structures, and then can actually create novel forms in that liminal or interdigitating space. I'm not saying the analogy is exact there. I'm just saying that there is an analogy there.
Yeah.
And that also, one of the things that I want to flag, although I'm not ready to speak on this in detail, but and I mentioned this a couple of times yesterday, is research programs in the foundations of mathematics itself, which try themselves very hard to escape the positing of predefined structures,
Mhm.
that are themselves more relational
Yeah.
in their origins, or in their approach. And there's a nice, I had a great chat with my friend and colleague Jason Tuckwell yesterday afternoon as well, who is a Simondon scholar, amongst other things. And he pulled out this other lovely Simondon quote, or kind of principle, because we were talking about the relationship between nominalism and realism, and kind of wanting to do justice to both of those things, really. And Simondon says something about, nominalism about terms, realism about relations, which dovetails to some
Mhm.
degree, with some of these approaches, like in category theory, and some derivations from that, topos theory, homotopy type theory, etc. So there's that. I don't think we can just gesture towards mathematical Platonism and say, oh well, look, we can follow that approach. And it's interesting to me, like some of the logic that Mike's applying, which I agree with, is he's saying that, well, physicalists often, we find some invariant that we didn't predict, and then we say, oh, that's just a brute fact about the world, and then we don't, we can't explain that, it's a brute fact. And Mike's saying he's against that because he thinks that's Mysterian. Okay, fine, I agree. But then what are you doing with the latent space? My real concern there is an account of the genesis of the structure of the latent space, and so avoiding simply moving that question about finding brute facts,
Mhm.
avoiding simply transposing that from the actual and calling it Mysterian there and putting it into the virtual and saying, oh, but in the virtual, all these facts just hold. And then it's like, well, that's exactly the same move. So I worry about that. And I worry about even what invoking again, we shall explore these different variations and perhaps partly through this Dan Smith paper, but on Platonism and on a kind of extension and an inversion and all of that of
Yeah.
the Platonic operators. But when we invoke Platonism and when we point to mathematical Platonism, I really worry that we're just moving that kind of Mysterianism about emergentism in the actual and just plonking that in the virtual in some sense. Um,
Mhm. Yeah. So I think the history, like putting mathematics in historical context is so important here to help illustrate um, the type of relationship that I think a process approach to these questions would want us to emphasize between actuality and potentiality, or between, the minds of mathematicians and this space of forms. Um, because I'm sensitive to your concern about the predefiniteness of that realm of forms. Um, but I feel like I'm searching for a way of preserving no more really than a realism of relations. I'm happy with that distinction between nominalism of terms and realism of relations. But, you know, mathematics ultimately is the study of patterns of relationship, relational patterns, let's put it that way. And, what I think we could say from a Whiteheadian point of view is that mathematical propositions, as they become part of the store of mathematical knowledge or mathematical truths. Mike likes to say mathematical facts, but I feel like it, that might not be the best term, because usually we want to say facts are empirical, and math discovers, I mean, a formalist understanding of math, which is limited, but they would say, we're just following it's a deductive truth. It's not so much a fact. It's
mhm,
necessary, given a set of premises and
mhm.
rules. It's almost like true by definition, you might say. Um,
Yeah,
but
and I just want to flag that I don't think that's as distinct from the way we pursue, hypotheses. We posit hypotheses and then pursue
yeah,
their implications in the empirical. And I think we can think about, obviously it beggars the categories to some degree, but there is an empirical approach to mathematics itself, right?
mhm,
Uh,
yeah.
anyway,
Which
go on. Yeah.
Well, which is what happened when Russell and Whitehead actually tried to work out in a formalist way, a logicist way,
Yeah.
how 1 + 1 equals, prove that 1 + 1 equals 2, that they ended up actually kind of discovering that they needed to make these patches to fix certain paradoxes. And so all of a sudden there's this contingent empirical aspect to, the algorithm they were trying to outline in their text.
That would make anyone a radical empiricist, wouldn't it?
Well, it did, Whitehead at least.
That's what I mean. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but um, but what if we could say, while mathematical propositions emerge in the course of history,
Mm,
that there's still, and I'll use Whitehead's terms here. I don't know if I could do better, but we mathematicians and all actual occasions of experience are they're conceptually prehending tensions in this web of possibilities. They're tensions. So there's something there to be felt. And
mm,
as but they're not just waiting for us to feel them and then delivering their objective content to us, because when we feel them, we change them.
mm.
There's an observer effect, right?
Yeah, but that really zeroes in on the nature of a process of actualization itself,
Mhm.
uh, because
So it's a
any
give and if it's a push and it's a give and take thing, though.
yeah,
So
yeah.
like it's not either discovery or creation. It's a relationship that transcends that dichotomy.
Exactly. Absolutely a false dichotomy, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though, especially when you look at that subset of mathematical form that is derived directly from physics, uh, you can say something like, nature invents, we discover. Um, which
Hmm.
already problematizes that distinction between invention and discovery. But then in the generalization, in the moving out from that into this broader mathematical landscape, then there is this very nuanced relationship with invention and discovery. And it's kind of important, and I think it will relate to some of Mike's minimal models, which I really, really like as well. But any form that we have perceived, and it is a kind of constructivist way of thinking about, like constructivism in the foundation of mathematics, of thinking about this as well. But any form that we have perceived with a sufficient degree of resolution, we have actualized that. That is a process of actualization, you know. And it doesn't, again, this is something that we talk about a lot, but it doesn't really, it might not at least make sense to imagine that that form in its definiteness as realized in the work of that mathematician pre-exists that, you know, perception and development of it, which again is always working under the influence of constraints that exceed the mathematician themselves. Obviously they are thrown, but they are in fact engaging in a process of actualization. And one of the things I want to refer Mike to, and I mentioned it, but because he quotes Jung a couple of times, he also quotes Poincaré, and I want to get to Poincaré, the Poincaré thing in a second as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I was
perhaps
just looking
our
for that quote.
perhaps our you know, at least the first part, you know, I'm leery of making Mike sit through like 9 hours of us talking about Jung, but you know, Mike quotes Jung a couple of times, and I think the first discussion that we had on Answer to Job, where we're really talking about this processual logic of actualization and its psychic real, you know, manifestation, is also, I think, quite relevant here.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Well, let me read Poincaré from his 1921 book. What was the title again? Um,
oh, it's the foundations of science, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. So he says, to invent, I have said, is to choose,
Mm.
but the word is perhaps not wholly exact. It makes one think of a purchaser before whom are displayed a large number of samples. The sterile combinations do not even present themselves to the mind of the inventor. Never in the field of his consciousness do combinations appear that are not really useful. All goes on as if the inventor were an examiner for the second degree who would only have to wait. All goes on as if the inventor were an examiner for the second degree who would only have to question the candidates who had passed a previous examination. And so there's a pre-sorting, he's saying.
Yeah,
Um,
well, this is, you know, the frame problem.
yeah,
He's articulating the frame problem as it exists within mathematics. Yeah.
right. And so what's establishing the relevance of the adjacent possibilities that, and you know, when Peirce talks about how Galileo was able to make some guesses that launched modern science, it's like if that was just a matter of sheer trial and error, um, it should have taken thousands of years for us to arrive at, you know, a law of physics. Um, so there's some kind of a relationship of relevance to this between our own um, thinking activity, which our cognition, let's say, which I love how Mike says um, morphogenesis is itself a cognitive process that's like the ingression of form at the level of our bodies um, is akin to the process of ingression of form in our own cognitive operations in our mathematical imagination. But what
But
establishes the relationships of relevance?
it's key that it's self-referential
Yeah.
in morphogenesis and in cognition in general, and that again is this reciprocity between actual and virtual here. You know,
Mhm.
it can't be one directional. It can't be the forms animating and it
No.
also can't, in my opinion, be the forms existing, you know, eternally. And Robert flagged this yesterday, but we could talk about, maybe we should just talk about what different ways of thinking about eternality or atemporality might be.
Mhm.
But under, you know, the forms being there in some eternal sense, that is not predicated on this reciprocal relationship with actuality is quite different from cognition, in my opinion, and quite different from morphogenesis, because there is a loop there, there is a feedback there. Um,
Yeah. But again, if we make the theological move and put the relationship between actuality and possibility itself in a process of divine cognition, they're never
oh,
separate.
problem solved. Uh,
Well, we're trying to avoid Mysterianism here, I guess.
yeah, but
But
I do think, yeah, I mean, so
I wonder if there's a difference there though between mysticism,
uh,
genuine mystical encounter with the ground of being, and Mysterianism, and where we might want to tease that out because
we do. We definitely want to tease that out.
there must be an end to the explanations we can offer, and then you
Yeah.
just have to experience it, you know.
But I mean, mysticism always ends in aporia. You know, mysticism ends in emptiness. Mysticism doesn't end in the positing of a giant explanatory function to remove uncertainty. Mysticism ends in uncertainty. That's where negative theology goes, right?
Yeah,
Um, and so I do think there's a really key distinction between mysticism and mysterianism. And in a sense, mysticism is about transcending explanation, not about like just getting outside that whole framework altogether. It's more like acceptance, because that's why I think of it as prosaic as well, right? So I have this notion of the prosaic mysticism because it's about like this now in some sense, you know, whatever that might be. It's not about how did this, why. It's not, it's living without why, you know, for Eckhart, you know, it's all of that. Whereas a conflation of mysticism with explanatory models in theology, those are really different things, you know, and they happen to, of course, they emerge in distinct traditions, but they happen to be very related, historically, contingently. But again, there are two very different things going on there. So, of course, Eckhart, for example, is going to use all the language of God, but of course, the Godhead beyond God and all of that. Because he is in a space of adjacency with a dominant theological tradition.
mhm,
But what he's talking about is precisely the abjuring of the explanatory function of the operators as, let's say, Plato lays them down. It's saying like we're getting out of that whole thing. And that, to me, that's the distinction between mysticism and Mysterianism. And as you know, again, there's a lot of nuance here, and you and I have been like going around and around on it for years now. But if we posit the big explainer, you know, um, then I worry, I worry that that is in fact the ultimate form of Mysterianism, the big explainer who is inexplicable. And of course, again, we're going to encounter the horizon at some point. I'm not
right,
saying that we're going to be able to explain everything. In fact, I'm saying something very, very, very different from that because incompleteness is very much core to the kind of, you know, hypothesis or you know positive generalization of principles that I'm pursuing,
right,
but it's all about minimizing explanatory debt on some level, which is not to say here's this you know realm of eternal object. Well, okay, sorry, I don't want to implicate Whitehead. Eternal forms and the demiurge who can contemplate them and all of that. I'm like, whoa, that is the ultimate in unexplained explainers,
yeah,
and that's why there's a history of attempts to deal with, and including in Plato himself, in attempts to deal with the explanatory debt that
yeah.
precisely that model erects or burdens us with.
So I think in this Dan Smith article about Deleuze and his inversion of Platonism,
Yeah.
or overturning of Platonism, you could say, which makes it sound like we're leaving it behind. But as Smith, I think, rightly points out, um, and as many philosophers, including Whitehead, have pointed out, we're always still thinking with Plato in one way or another. And Plato was thinking with, the philosophers who came before him, but I think doing so with the benefit of the alphabet, for one, um, and like a new media technology, which allowed him to write these dialogues, which is a play on the theater, that was the previous form of social technology through which this mystery was mediated. Um, the mystery being the relationship between embodied human life and the gods or the beyond, whatever is on the other side of that horizon, which, yeah, we have to deal with that. that interface, recognize our epistemic limits, but also tell a likely story about what's going on here. And the story that Plato tells in Timaeus, or the mythospeculative adventure he goes on in that dialogue, which includes several false starts and like, you're never given the sense of a neat, tidy system by in the Timaeus. Um, but that structure of something like what Plotinus would later make very explicit of the one beyond being this ineffable nothing, but also everything that overflows itself into the intellect or the nous, the demiurge, that then overflows itself into the world soul, that overflows itself into nature, the physical world, that overflows itself into just materiality, which is a kind of nothing again. Um,
Trickle down. It's trickle down economics,
it's trickle down, yeah, metaphysics.
Mm.
Um, but even if we want to, roast the emanationist conception as just absurd or um, puerile, as Whitehead calls it, actually. Um, there's still a basic structure there that we're always working within, rearranging, putting this on top of that instead of this, the order that Plotinus had it in. And even for a materialist, you still say something about what is the intellect, how, there's something intelligent about how human beings are figuring all this stuff out. So you reduce the cosmic mind to human cognitive function. Okay, fine. You still have a sense of at least the animate inner lives of human beings as a materialist, that you like people suffer, feel pain, right? So the soul is still showing up, even if you call it, you know, whatever, something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
If you find yourself denying the realities of lived experience and
yeah,
saying, some sort of mechanical clockwork mechanism is more real than them, like you've taken a major wrong turn.
yeah. So my only point here is just that the general categories that were laid out in Neoplatonism and Platonism are still the categories that we think with. And I agree with like Deleuze completely that philosophy is about the creation of new concepts. But I think a concept is different than an eternal object,
Well,
because
can
we
we?
have something ingressed. But yeah,
I was just going to say, can we also just point to all the relationships of adjacency that we're talking about here? Because we're talking in evolutionary terms, is what you're saying here, right?
right.
Even like
Yes, right.
Plato's use of the theatrical form, of the conceptual personae, which is the Deleuzian term, but as the mouthpieces for the ideas. So as you say, the theater was the primary sort of locus of, and the theater, and of course myth, which is staged as well, which is a narrative form.
Mhm.
Those were the primary, media in which the relationship between actual and virtual, heavens and earth, and all of that were explored previously. And so there's an absolute relationship of adjacency just in terms of the form that Plato adopts. And then Plato is kind of in his fusion of something that's really, I mean, we think of it as the Socratic moral philosophy, right? So Socrates, innovation, with what the natural philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratic, or I guess Nietzsche would call them the pre-Platonic philosophers, were doing, which also then happens to be a kind of recovery of categories that are associated. And again, I think Dan Smith goes into this, but with the state form as it exists, prior to Athens, around Athens, and so we can talk about the isonomia and the so a kind of principle of equality, but we can talk about that as a principle as opposed to its real political instantiations in the nonetheless hierarchical society in Athens. But you can think about these pre-Socratical, pre-Platonic philosophers exploring a kind of isonomic or whatever cosmology, and then Plato, in a sense, is restoring hierarchy by fusing the moral philosophy with the natural philosophy. But then Plato is in so doing, he's creating this structure. He's basically saying like, well, you natural philosophers are like super hasty. In fact, we need these ordering principles that we can't derive from the materials themselves. Um, and he is
Yeah.
then creating this cosmogony, and in again in many ways it resembles what Hesiod had given the Greeks, and so this distillation of mythic operators, but in response to and having gone through that relatively brief history of the natural philosophical attempt to eliminate some of those things, and he's like, no, 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 you're too hasty. But then he is creating this grand ness, this grand attractor, this arena in which so much of, and obviously we know Whitehead's quote, and I did have occasion to pull it out a couple of times in the discussion with Mike and Robert, and you know, your Twitter handle and your blog and all of that, the footnotes to Plato thing. Uh, yeah, so Plato has set this arena. He's populated it with players. So he set the stage. He's populated it with operators. Um, and then, precisely as you say, even the most anti-Platonic philosophers in the 19th and 20th century, in your Nietzsche's and obviously
Popper.
Popper, well, yeah, that's different, but yes, I mean, Popper's so Platonic about the evolution of ideas. It's like he's so Platonic and so Hegelian, and he hates Plato and Hegel. Um,
Their
talk about
politics, at least.
yeah. I mean, but talk about shadow projection. Popper being the most dogmatic anti-dogmatist of the of the modern era.
I
Uh,
mean, like, he barely escaped fascism and was traumatized, so I cut him some
Yeah,
slack.
yeah, yeah. And I mean to be honest, I think he's still an underrated philosopher despite his huge influence in a kind of narrow and slightly misunderstood reading of his philosophy. And so many of the responses to Popper, Kuhn, Feyerabend, Lakatosh, they're still Popperian. But that's a different, and again, not to say that those guys aren't innovators and doing important things, but just like we're all Platonists, they are still in that arena that Popper has set. But yeah, so all I'm saying is totally agree with you. The operators are there, and those philosophers, especially those though who are pursuing the ontological project,
Yeah.
and more or less systematically. And of course, Deleuze would claim that even Nietzsche was much more systematic than he let on. But that's Deleuze buggering
Yeah.
Nietzsche. But of course, Deleuze has systematic ambitions, and so
Yeah.
he therefore finds it absolutely necessary to work within that Platonic tradition.
So, yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm glad we're on the same page about that, that we can't escape the inheritance, and that the evolution of consciousness. And when we ask these questions, just presupposes this history. We've been canalized by Plato, for better or worse. But this relationship between the physiologoi, the pre-Platonist nature
Um,
philosophers, and what Plato was doing, I think, is somewhat akin to the relationship between Hegel and Schelling with regard to how we understand nature or the physical world and the social or moral world. Because one way of understanding what Plato is doing is reminding the physiologoi that all their speculations about the nature of nature are socially mediated. And
mhm.
so there are ethical conditions of the possibility of philosophy about nature. And so, and even
But
structurally, that's, yeah.
sorry to keep interrupting, but I find it really fascinating that what you just very accurately pointed out is that, Plato is a historicist and a social
Mm.
constructivist. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
in that,
because
in that sense, Yeah.
for sure. Um, and then structurally with the dialogues as a dramatic attempt to dramatize this conceptual relationship, um, the Timaeus comes after the Republic, um, right? Which is to say, the study of nature comes after the study of the rightly ordered society and the rightly ordered soul. And so Plato's trying to say, hey, like, we need to begin actually with the human in our natural environment, which is culture, um, before we rush to understand the nature of the universe. But the first thing he says at the beginning of the first thing, Socrates says at the beginning of the Timaeus is, you know, asking Timaeus if he can tell us, like, now that we know how the city is ordered and
Yeah, yeah.
where did it come from and what's its cosmic history? What are its cosmological conditions of possibility? How is it that there might be the possibility of philosopher kings and queens intelligently organizing a society? Um, what does that tell us about the nature of the cosmos that this society came out of, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I just again flag an interesting historical connection because to me, again, what you're articulating reminds us that, Kant, whatever, if it's a Copernican inversion, it's a Platonic reversion because Kant
mhm.
is doing exactly the same thing for the early modern science. He's
Yeah,
saying, hang on a second, before you get too wild here, remember that you are, socially situated. You're a limited human being. You are conditioned in all of these ways, and we need to study the soul, the
yeah,
structure of the soul, i.e., the structure of what we would think of later of as human cognition before we like that is the prolegomena to any future metaphysics is understanding the nature of the subject because of what the subject will otherwise unconsciously project and
yeah.
one of the
Just to
points.
nitpick though, like the soul, I mean, he would say we don't want to psychologize Kant because he wasn't doing psychology. He was what are the conditions for any science, psychology, physics, biology. So there's like even before we can talk about a soul, because that was one of Kant's ideas of reason that we can't actually know.
Sure, for sure, for sure. I mean,
But that's just I know what you're saying though. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I just want to nuance that a little bit.
God, soul, and world, like the
Yeah.
um,
But this structure, the relationship between Plato and the physiologoi before him, and the mediating role of the ethical or well, I don't want to conflate ethical and moral because Dan Smith distinguishes, but the difference between the moral and the natural, and the
mm,
way that Plato prioritizes the moral, and
mm,
says if we're going to understand the human moral capacity, not to mention our intellect,
yeah.
um, we're going to need to like front load our explanation of nature. In other words, we have to presuppose, I mean, it's kind of an anthropic principle. But Schelling and Hegel have a similar, I think, tension between the two of them, where Schelling's natural philosophy assumes we just can intuit
Yeah.
the dynamic patterns of nature, right, directly, whereas without mediation, whereas Hegel says, no, actually, that's mediated by spirit. Our philosophy of nature is mediated by spirit in the sense that culture, to use a less loaded word. And so until we understand the history of our own consciousness as cultural beings and, how consciousness has unfolded and evolved, we're never going to be able to reach immediately into nature. We're always going to be mediated by our concepts.
And that's why we study the history of philosophy,
Yeah.
because we're looking to understand the canalizing constraints that are coming to us as thought forms from a particular and potentially, I mean, not potentially, obviously, contingent history of thought and cultural constraint. And I guess a kind of, Schellingian response almost to Hegel there is like, but we were natural beings also before we were cultural beings. We're already part of nature. And it's
Yeah.
absolutely true that our reflections on nature are mediated through this cultural inheritance of all of these thought forms. But in a sense, we still have a direct relationship with nature because we are that, you know.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, culture is an intensification of nature, from a Schellingian point of view. Nature was always already spirit, um, slumbering spirit, as Leibniz might say. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to give Hegel the last word on that, but I
No,
just know.
I know you wouldn't. And I don't think we would necessarily explore this right now, but there's something that we've touched on a couple of times, which is an implication of the free energy principle and the kind of non-dual reading of the free energy principle. Um, but also the transcendental reading of the free energy principle, which is that we are coupling to all these variables, we're tracking all these variables in our environment, but we are, in order to track them, necessarily differentiating ourselves from them. So we're actually necessarily putting a limit on our knowledge of them. By not simply fusing with them at that level of description. So, a condition of independence yeah, of conditional independence, sparse coupling, is a bound on the kind of participatory knowledge that you can have of other things in nature. Um, Otherwise, you just become them. And I mean that can obviously be Platonized in a sense that is, if you were imagining that the things in nature that you're coupling to were the thing in themselves. I mean, this is Kantian as well, but were the things in themselves. You are only ever, and here we go into the representationalist thesis and things that an activists don't like about the FEP and all of that, but you are only ever, a reflection of them or a representation of them. You are never those things in themselves. But that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And of course, that doesn't preclude. So, our access, by virtue of the fact that we are distinguishable, we distinguish ourselves as individuals. Our access is mediated, right? It's not direct in that
Yeah.
sense, but that absolutely doesn't preclude a more or less noetic, direct access to things. And again, we could talk.
Especially if, yeah, Whitehead says the world is a medium for the transmission of feelings. And
Yeah,
so everything is mediated in a sense, but the nature of that transmission is such that what was over there becomes in here, right? And this this
require sufficient statistics of the embedding environment is a very deflationary and sort of technical way of
yeah,
saying
I
same
I
thing.
think I think there are philosophies that you and I talk a lot about that can help FEP theorists catch up with what science has already said about how this works, instead of reaching for philosophical explanations of the FEP that are actually representationalist.
Yeah.
Um, you
But
can
I
read
think it does diffuse the tension in a way
between an
between,
activism and yeah, I think so too.
but also and the Dan Smith paper is really good on this because it's about the history of representationalism to some
Right.
degree.
Right.
Um, Diffuses the tension between representationalism and non-representationalism as well.
Well,
Because
the
yeah,
I mean, Deleuze's understanding of repetition as the alternative to representation, which is
yeah,
yeah, just another way of framing the difference between the Platonic paradigm, quote unquote, of original and copy versus the Deleuzian inversion of that, where it's simulacra all the way down, not copies, but just differences that only have differences in common with each other.
yeah.
And
This is also partly what I mean about when I say constructive coarse graining or endogenous coarse graining, is the
yeah,
sense that, you might be a kind of representation or model of your environment, but you're also a, novel, real, actualized thing. You are not having a model, you're embodying a model, as might be said in that literature, but it's not an anti-realist framing at all. It's this model,
yeah,
this representation is itself a new thing amongst the things in the world, a new, real,
yeah.
actual.
This is Whitehead says to Descartes, like who, Descartes says, this is my body. So he, Descartes describing his relationship, the relationship between his soul and his body. And he says, we say, this is my body. That sort of belongs to the soul. And Whitehead says, you should say, this is my world. So in other words, the whole environment is involved in
Yeah,
organism, right? There's no real separation. And this is why with FEP, like you can invert the organism environment relationship and say that the environment is modeling the organism, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that again, there's a nuanced philosophical critique necessary of saying things in that way.
Mhm.
But yes, I mean, formally, it's a symmetrical relationship across the Markov blanket, right?
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
there are other questions to get in there. What you're also flagging then about, Whitehead's response to Descartes does resonate with what very good catch that you found in the Dan Smith article, where he says that ideas are in the Deleuzian framework, immanent to simulacra. But as you rightly note, page 44 to 45 in What is Philosophy, in this edition, it is a specific critique in terms of the plane of immanence of this notion that things are immanent to something else. It's like, no, everything is together. That's the whole point of the plane of immanence. It's not that there's this object that things are immanent to. It's that subject object or system environment distinction actually breaks down at the level of the plane of immanence. Like that's the whole point of immanentism, as opposed to a kind of transcendentalism
But
or
even it's just an artifact of how difficult it is to not think in terms of the polarity between transcendence and immanence. And
yeah,
even Deleuze and Guattari in that text say that the plane of immanence can't be thought, really. Um, it's, we can,
condition of thought is the thinker that differentiates itself from the plane of immanence, right?
yeah. So we can forgive Dan Smith for thinking in such terms, but Deleuze also and Guattari in that text talk about philosophers like Christian philosophers like Kierkegaard and Nicholas of Cusa who they feel recharge even though they're thinking about transcendence and infinity um and the divine. They're doing so in a way that recharges immanence, I think is how they put it, because there's an incarnational vector to their thinking, and a emphasis on the inextricable entanglement of transcendence and immanence, as a result of the incarnational vector of their philosophies. And so even in Deleuze and Guattari, there's still a sense that it's not like the word transcendence becomes, or
Yeah,
all significations of that term all of a sudden become verboten. It's that we have to be careful about, we want to pay attention to the effects of these types of
yeah.
concepts.
Yeah, and then you get to the concept of the immanent transcendent, which Jung uses that hyphenated term, Deleuze uses that hyphenated term, or transcendence within immanence, and that is the conditional separation, the conditional independence, right?
Right.
Um,
Right. And I think Whitehead's term creativity is just an attempt to say that transcendence dash immanence, in the sense that it's you can't think it, but there's nothing that isn't it. And it's, I think the closest analog to what Deleuze means by difference in itself would be creativity. It's just that Whitehead adds a divine function, which to my mind helps us avoid something that leads to simulacra all the way down, where I feel like we've lost ourselves when we just have groundlessness and no sense of a vector, towards no sense of a value vector, I'll put it that way. And I think there's still an ethical charge to Deleuze's work, so this is still there. But then let me go back to what I was talking about earlier with repetition, because I think this is a through line to what I'm getting at here. Um, Deleuze's account of repetition and the role that repetition plays in perception and memory, and as an alternative to this representational account with, copying the original, um, it's very much like what Whitehead means by physical prehension. That a physical prehension is a kind of repetition of, um, a feeling that was in another actual occasion that then perishes and is transmitted to another actual occasion. That feeling is taken up. It's a repetition. It's not a copy. It is, as Whitehead would say, it's the way in which one subject becomes immanent to another subject, which is, he quotes Aristotle saying that that's impossible. one subject cannot be internal to another subject. And Whitehead's like, no, that happens all the time. That's prehension. And I think it's what Deleuze is pointing to with this idea of repetition, which he also gets from Hume, and Whitehead does a deep study of Hume on repetition as well. So I'm not sure when Deleuze was reading Whitehead versus when he must have been already reading him and when he was writing Difference and Repetition. But anyways, um,
It gets what I think one
one
mention.
citation, yeah.
Three.
Um, but just because Whitehead spent so much time on repetition in Hume's account of perception and process and reality, I wouldn't be surprised if Deleuze read that. But in any event, what's left out of the Deleuzian account, I would say, is conceptual prehension, the mental pole, which, Deleuze has his virtual, and obviously he addresses this in his own way, but it's not just repetition for Whitehead. Like an actual occasion of experience also has um, some relationship to relevance and in the conceptual prehension or in the mental pole of an actual occasion, there is this, as Mike would say, a dipping into a field of possibilities. And I'll say they're not they're not pre-actualized. They're not these possibilities are not already uh, uh, actualized, waiting to be, or in Mike's sense, actively pushing into the organic world. Um, but there's some kind of tension that's there already that we can conceptually feel and feel that it's patterned in some way, and that we didn't just make the pattern by trying to feel it. The pattern was there in some sense. And as we feel it, it's always going to be responsive to the perspective we're taking on it. But and that those feelings though for Whitehead are there's some aim behind our feeling of these forms,
Mm,
conceptual prehension, and that's both a subjective aim that's imminent to that occasion, but there's also an initial aim, he calls it, or a divine aim, which is this the divine aim, the primordial nature of God, he calls it, is the way in which the network of tensions in the field of possibility is already tuned in some sense.
mm,
In some
mm,
minimal sense, maybe maximally simple sense, even.
yeah,
There's a pre-tuning, and that provides a sense of a final cause uh,
mm,
to a
mm,
compressing actual occasion that's not determining it, but luring it, giving its every occasion's conceptual prehension of this network of possibilities has um, a certain structure of persuadability. That's another term that Mike uses that I think is very Whiteheadian. In other words, there's a certain relevance relationship, and we feel
mm.
as we conceptually prehend that network, we feel lured in a way that turns what would otherwise be indefinitely vague into, like Poincaré was talking about. It's
Mm.
as if it's been pre-sorted in a way. Like we're the second examiner. Um,
Yeah, but I mean, but we are because we are thrown. I mean, I'm not trivializing it because
mhm.
I agree with all of that, and there's just so much juice in all that Whiteheadian, um, structure, consideration, development of this framework. But we are thrown into a very deep cosmic history, and so we're not just the second examiners of most of the things that we
Even if
are.
we call it a cosmic history, then I think we would need some divine function in the sense of the consequent nature of God, as Whitehead understands it, because that's the cosmic memory. We're embedded in this history. We're inheriting all of that. But you know, do you agree that we need to give some account of like what's holding all that history? Because we have ourselves here now, and there's this
Yeah.
memory that we're drawing on. It's not a memory etched in our brains. It's a memory that's stored in the entire spatio-temporal environment, right? What
Wow.
is that? Whitehead calls it the consequent nature of God. We could just call it the history of the universe, but
No, yeah, I mean, yes, I think we need an account of that and the way that it is built into us. Um, so that's an account of inheritance, basically.
right.
Uh, so we do need that, yes, in the sense that that history isn't, to your point, here with us in the present as such, as as actualized, in even though it is actually at the same
Yeah,
time.
it's not here in the way that we might measure, the physical stuff that's like seemingly instantaneously present. That's
But
presentationally new to us now.
it's here in the invariance in our measurements, in the fact,
Mhm.
like, and again, so we can say that that grounds the possibility of science and reproducibility, that there is consistency,
Mhm.
which is precisely how, in a just bog standard evolutionary way of thinking, we reconstruct ancestral states via you know the depth of invariance, right? So there are invariants that characterize, clades at various levels of depth. There are invariants that characterize, all of life. There are invariants that characterize the whole cosmic epoch,
Yeah.
etc. Um,
There are different options here. Like we don't need to go Whitehead's route, but there's a problem here that needs to be addressed. Like Descartes addresses this question by saying like God recreates the universe in each instant.
sure, yeah.
You know, I don't like that one as much as Whitehead's.
No, no, I think Whitehead, you know, has a nice, very elegant solution. Um, the
Even
question,
though,
and
yeah,
there's
even
always
though
a
there's
question.
another sense in which the universe is being recreated in each moment, even in Whitehead's scheme, but in a
Yeah,
different
yeah,
way.
sure. I think there's also the question of whether we adopt the terminology and what
Sure.
is implied by the terminology as well. I mean, there's so much in what you just said, man. So it's really really hard to make a
All right.
coherent response to all of that. So. I mean, very much in passing, yeah, there's an ethical charge to Deleuze's work. I mean, of course, um, one can talk about the influence of Guattari in terms of reorienting Deleuze from the speculative to the here and now and the political. But of course, that's also overstated in some sense, in that Deleuze was already involved very much in an ethical project. Yeah, Deleuze is a deeply ethical, and Dan Smith there makes that distinction, as you gestured towards, between the ethical and the moral, and that's a very important distinction for Deleuze, which we don't necessarily need to go into, but yes, he has an ethical project. There's absolutely no question. In terms of the relationship between his work on Hume and difference and repetition, I think obviously his work on Hume is with him throughout his career, but it is also interesting that my impression just from the citation is that maybe he'd only just, or relatively recently come to grips with Whitehead, or started to come to grips with Whitehead. And of course, he addresses Whitehead at much greater length in The Fold later on, and indeed in What is Philosophy, Whitehead comes up a number of times. But there's 15 years between Empiricism and Subjectivity, his major large book on Hume, or his main book on Hume. He has actually wrote about Hume even before that. And difference and repetition. So he's doing a lot of stuff in the meantime. And of course, I want to flag that one of the major encounters that it seems like he had in the meantime is with Simondon, and in '66, so 2 years before difference and repetition, he writes this review of, I guess it's the first two parts of Simondon's big book on individuation. So it doesn't include, interestingly, the parts on psychic individuation, which wouldn't be published until much later, but it's physical and vital individuation, those sections of Simondon's book, Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. Um, and he writes this review in which he says that Simondon comes up with a new conception of the transcendental. And so when we're thinking about this field of this differential field, this field of pure difference, that we can absolutely link that to Whitehead. And I think there are real resonances there. And I think that the quote you shared yesterday or the day before from James Bradley also brings those out. But this is the Simondonian conception. This is something that you could, and again, I think, Deleuze has so many influences, and his own particular genius is the way that he integrates so many different influences. But you could understand that as being taken almost directly from Simondon. And then if we're to go to the simulacrum, and your concern, well, you're linking a concern about the ethical project with this notion of sort of simulacra all the way down. Um, really then we just would be talking about, to generalize that into an ontological thesis, is just to say that, structure, is self-grounding. Like there's some, and yes, there is a primordial differential tension in a fluctuating and unstable field. That would be the sort of Simondonian conception of the pre-individual in its kind of naked primordial state, even though, Simondon is trying to say that that is a transcendental condition, not an actual, past necessarily, like not an actual primordium in the kind of more classically evolutionary sense, even though there are it's clear that those things are very, very closely related. Um, but it's the way, you know, being, becoming grounds being, so like, right. So this very thoroughgoing processualism, and that doesn't preclude, as we were discussing with the free energy principle, the development of models. And we can go into esoteric philosophies for the self-mirroring nature of being, and ways in which nature comes to view itself, and all of that kind of stuff. And that may mean we will have a place for those functions of the primordial nature of God. And I mean, it is the scheme is not different in terms of the operators really from Whitehead either, just as we're saying that the operators are in some deep sense the Platonic ones, but there is a difference of emphasis again. And where Whitehead has his principle of creativity and his cosmos is creativity first, and so you can analogize that with the Simondon Deleuze view of the pure difference coming first. Simondon is nonetheless wanting to say something about how definite structures emerge from that field of, pure difference or the pre-individual. And I don't have a full handle on exact, because he's quite subtle in his handling of this and maybe not fully consistent. I'm not sure, but he will say that we can't say anything quite definite about, like, it's pre-definite, it's preconceptual in a sense, but nonetheless there is an operational schema that he wants to say is realized in that, like a minimal operational schema of the existence basically of a gradient, which is the tension between two orders of magnitude, and the emergence of the individual as a kind of as a mediator, basically, that creates the possibility of communication between those orders of magnitude, which were in some sense moving away from each other and increasing the tension. And so to, there's always a this kind of many one thing going on there, in that, and the way Simondon will say that is that it's always more than a unity, so it's always multiple, but it's also a unity, and the individual itself, once it emerges, because it is still embedded within, and permeated by, and again, different ways of saying this are going to have slightly different implications, but by the pre-individual. So the individual always has the charge of the pre-individual milieu with it, and it's got this kind of annexed charge, like it's got its own adjacency relationship, right, with the pre-individual. So it's taking that with it. So the individual then is itself always more than a unity, right? And we can then translate that kind of thing and all the wonderful things you've been saying about tension in the Whiteheadian scheme into a discussion of frustration in many-body systems, and the kinds of things we were talking about last week with natural induction. So I think there are principled ways of making all of those accounts, and I think so. We could probably talk about, because you'd messaged me on WhatsApp about very briefly, but about this concern one might have about the ethical project if one has an ontology that's simulacra all the way down. So if we kind of do away with models, and I think we can talk about that in this framework, because we're not doing away with models. We're just talking about how they themselves are constructed, and again, how there's always this feedback, like whatever's been constructed up until now is in some sense, well, it's informing the ongoing evolution, right? So there's an inheritance of the past, and it provides us with models. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking more about the classic like transcendentals, truth,
mhm,
beauty, and goodness, which obviously we want to avoid anyone having,
mhm,
or justice. I could throw in that too. Um, we want to avoid anyone claiming like that they have the final word on what any of those are, which is exactly what the Platonic dialogues make clear. But they still they're pointers, I guess. They're limit concepts that orient us.
mhm,
And I just, as much as I think it's important um, to have the sophist sort of doing their annoying thing, or even to have Socrates, which, like as Plato and Smith point out, Plato has Socrates eventually, get into this bind where it's not clear whether he's the same as the sophist. Um, and this plays out in the relationship between um, Christ and the Antichrist, or God and Satan. It's like, and even Whitehead has a point in Process and Reality where he's like, sometimes this primordial nature, this initial aim, um, behaves in a satanic way, that more like a trickster. But so this idea of the simulacrum, I think, is important to disturb any settled sense of having acquired unmediated access to the transcendent, whether transcendent truth or beauty or goodness. They're transcendentals, which that's not what Thomas Aquinas meant when he called them that, but in the Kantian sense, that they're like limit concepts.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
well, ideals of reason are they orient us in the space of possibility, and as long as we keep them in that space of possibility, and we don't try to immanentize or actualize them, and immanentize them in the bad sense, not in Deleuze's sense. In Eric Voegelin's sense, like don't immanentize the eschaton. Um, we then I think we're safe, and we have moral orientation, and you know, ethics and morality are both um, important, I think, and morality needs to be constantly critiqued by ethics. And what I mean by that is if we just have this sense of a self-righteous moral attitude, like, we know what the good is, and we're not engaged in ongoing relationship and negotiation with others, then I think we end up doing both ethical and moral harm, right? So I,
yeah. No, I
yeah,
agree with all of that, and I really don't think any of the any of that is threatened, basically. I don't think that the ideal function of the limit concepts is threatened by a thoroughgoing constructivism. I think the problem that we have had, is that constructivism has been, social constructivism, and it's and with many very well-intentioned good reasons, there's been a desire to construct contingent norms, and which are in many, which are socioculturally, historically contingent. There's been a desire to deconstruct those to increase the degrees of freedom of people pursuing their own projects of individuation. And I think that that's an important project, but I think it can have certain problematic consequences, which I think you're gesturing towards, when we don't nonetheless preserve those limit concepts. Like there is such an ideal as truth that we want to strive for, without, again, claiming that any privileged group has access to it. And of course, the problem historically has been that that's what groups have always done.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but the thoroughgoing constructivism, which is really the evolutionary constructivism, or what I like to call constructive realism, that's this ontological thing we're discussing, and that goes, I don't know if I want to say it goes deeper or whatever, it's not like it's necessarily more important, but perhaps it helps us to think more clearly about the nature of those transcendental limit concepts, if we go much more, if we pursue our constructivist methodology, so we feel as though we can deconstruct just to see, not just to destroy and to break things down, but to see what are in fact the degrees of freedom here. And when will we discover those,
Yeah.
again, that's a limit concept. That's an ideal. When will we discover the ultimate constraints on our cosmic epoch or whatever you want, however you want to talk about them? If that's
Yeah.
even, again, as we always say, if that's even a meaningful thing to say. But I think you can, and this is the process relational, or the way that the process relational project, even of a Deleuze, is still in touch with the Platonic,
Mhm.
is that it's not about saying that there aren't these limit concepts. It's not about saying that there aren't real possibilities and a virtual plane with differentiated possibilities in it, as distinguished, of course, from definite or pre-definite or obviously predeterminate possibilities, but differentiate. No one, no, I say no one. I mean, many people may have wanted to do away with that, but the thoroughgoing process relational project, as I understand it, is not about wanting to do away with those things at all, but it is about accounting for them in a certain way
Yeah.
because of the danger. And this is why it is an ethical project, because there's a danger that, again, history shows us is a very, very real danger, that when you don't try to account for those transcendental ideals, those limit concepts, when you say that they are beyond deconstruction, you are almost always conflating some contingent historical manifestation of truth. You're putting a capital T on your own contingent understanding of what truth is. And that's what it is to say this concept, this object, which is rendered in this definite form, is a sacred cow that is beyond um,
Right.
deconstruction. And so
Which, yeah.
well, the ethical project of um, process relational ontology is to say, no, no, you can't have that for you can't have that for any definiteness,
Right.
right? You
Yeah.
can't have pre-definiteness here. You can't say this definiteness, this object, this determinacy, whatever, is absolute. In fact, you've got, admit of the possibility of its destruction or deconstruction, and see how it goes. And that actually is the ethical project of depth psychology, by the way, as articulated by someone like Eric Neumann, the Jungian Eric Neumann. That's the commitment to doing that on a personal level, which
Yeah.
is going into one's own axioms, in one's own givens, and seeing, what happens to them when we try
And
to create wiggle room.
yeah.
Um,
And I know Mike's project is ethically motivated too. He's very concerned about these novel minds that whether they're human machine hybrids of whatever sort and maybe totally machinic forms of sentience and intelligence that are maybe already with us, depending on how you define these things. Um, and I think that's a real concern. Particularly, I'm more focused on the human machine hybrid cyborg type of or biological biotech applications where there is some uh, I know Mike likes agential material as a general term that captures both what like organic tissue does as well as what uh, some forms of fully artificial um, robotic technology might do. But I know he's ethically motivated for that reason and probably others, but one of the concerns that we might have with the sort of Platonism that he's putting forward, where there are actual agencies operating in this space of forms, is that, and especially if the research project is to get a scientific handle on what those pre-existing, predeterminate uh, agential patterns are, I think we're setting ourselves up to have a potentially a kind of scientism that's dogmatically asserting that no, we know what the structure of this is the only possibility here, and we know it. We have mathematical or whatever kind of proof might be provided in this new research program, And I think
Yeah.
that's, and I know I'm not saying, I'm not trying to put this on Mike, but it's one of the implications of, why it's important metaphysically, where we attribute the agency,
Yeah.
and where we attribute the determinacy,
Yeah.
and the decision making, um, because we're going to enter. So, and then if we go back to the question of non-human machinic forms of sentience, our artificial general intelligence, and all these sorts of things, I think the real interesting question there, the important question, is not so much when will those other beings, or can those other beings, become sentient or conscious or intelligent in the way we mean human beings are intelligent, but more about our relationships with them and our sense of ethical
Mm.
inclusion. Because we could, as human beings, as biological critters, decide to welcome these autonomous, semi-autonomous, I mean, we're semi-autonomous, also, but these robotic beings, into our social circles and start to treat them
Mm.
ethically. And then
Yeah.
the question of whether or not they're independently conscious is like moot almost, because we're
Yeah.
not independently conscious either.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, it also is how will it reflect on us when this thing, which is triggering all of our, relational sympathies, of course, by imitating a model, by being a simulacrum in a very literal sense of us.
Yeah,
How will it then reflect on us ethically if we don't respond ethically to that? Like it will be calling, whether it's conscious or not, it'll be calling us to an ethical encounter. I mean, it already is in some important ways.
yeah,
When you interact with a language model, it projects a lot of personality, right?
yeah,
And of course, this doesn't mean we should, immediately believe that there is a personality behind it in some, deep ontological metaphysical sense. This is what we're discussing, but it does then, should you be polite to it? Should you be,
yeah.
really, and how will that feed back on the way you relate with other agents?
And
Uh,
yourself. I mean, the
yeah,
deconstructive move here is to say, uh, oh, this LLM is just like constructing this personality as it goes along from, a kind of, memory of past instances. And but then if you reflect on ourselves, it's like kind of constructing our personalities as we go along based on our inheritance of past instance generalizations from past instances. And
how
uh,
how do adjacency relations actually work in analogically in both of those situations? Next token prediction is an
yeah.
adjacency relation.
Yeah.
Um,
So the deconstructive move here is to look back at what we thought the original was, that the robot's the copy of, and say, oh, wait, the original was already a copy or a simulacrum. I mean,
Yeah,
um,
well, I very much agree that the deconstructive, because I thought you were going somewhere else with this, the deconstructive move is not to put ourselves on a pedestal or on the undeconstructible,
right.
hard ground of, well, we're real agents, we're and then, project from that position of seeing ourselves as the ultimate model,
Yeah.
deconstruct the other in this encounter. But it is exactly to say what does this entail about us, which again, we talked about this last week and we've talked about it many times. That's not going to mean reducing us to automata, but it
No.
is going to mean nuancing the conceptual landscape in that intermediacy. And yes, where we are semi-autonomous. Our autonomy is always deeply conditioned and deeply constrained, but that doesn't mean it's not real. This is
No, like Emmanuel Levinas's phenomenology of the other, in the sense of, like, if we frame our sense of, human agency around identity as if each of us has this,
mm,
essence that, can't be violated, and that, that's to assume that, really, from a phenomenological point of view, that we have some sense of closure, that others don't impinge, that, you know as what's the French poet's name that said, I am another, um Rimbaud, I think. I am another. Like, we're already
yeah,
non-identical to ourselves. And so all
yeah,
that's to say, like, I fully embrace and welcome deconstruction in the Derridian and Heideggerian and Nietzschean sense, as, of of great ethical importance. And I
Mm.
think Deleuze's inversion of Platonism and war machine against essentialism is important, really important, and we need to recognize the depth of construction that we're engaged in when we're developing norms, um,
Yeah.
but also um, I think there is uh, a very subtle and intangible um, kind of lure that I don't want to, that may be better to call transcendental, if not instead of transcendent.
Oh.
Um, but it seems to me that this isn't about choosing ethics over morality.
Mm.
It's about holding the tension between the two, I guess. Um,
Depending on what one means by morality, right? If that means knowing what the categorical imperative is, in some definite, determinate sense, that
it just
that might,
means being in relationship to truth, beauty, goodness as ideals
yeah, but
that,
then they're numinous, right? And that's
yes,
important. They're
yes,
numinous in the sense that they are autonomous, in that they are greater than. Um, we do not subsume them, we cannot hold them. And I mean, of course, that's a very Platonic
yeah,
way of putting it. And I don't disagree that that's important. And it's the regulative principle. And we might have our issues with the way Kant generalizes that as well. And maybe sometimes he confuses some particular determinate
yeah,
belief or reality with the regulative principle itself, as he does with Newtonian mechanics, for example, in a slightly
yeah.
different context. But look, on the ethical side of Mike's project, which I did want to come back to really quickly, I think he's asking this or making this sort of Spinozist but expressionist Spinozism, so also somewhat Deleuzian Spinozism, asking this question of what can a body do? We don't know what a body can do, and that where that integrates with his work in regenerative medicine and all of those sorts of things, it's much more an opening of possibilities than it is a closing down of possibilities. And I think one thing that's important. And that's what you were gesturing at is ensuring that the ontology and the way again, the nature of this reciprocal interaction between the actual and the virtual also reflects that openness, and isn't a way to kind of accidentally close things down. Because if I were to say something, I suppose, really critical, and I hope Mike would forgive me, I don't think the thesis that he's articulating here is radical. Like he does say a number of times that it's radical. It might be
Going
radical.
back to the root,
Yeah,
back to Plato.
yeah, okay, yeah. So etymologically speaking, that's a nice gloss. But in the more colloquial sense that I think Mike intends it, it's radical in relation to the mechanical philosophy only.
Yeah.
And it's very traditional, and you could put a capital T on that traditional, because this is a kind of Christian Neoplatonism. And so that's something that we might want to. So I think some of these process relational middle grounds are actually much more radical in relation to the history of ideas.
Mm.
Um, so that
Yeah.
just something that I wanted to say. Um,
Can I think because we've been talking about deconstruction, I wanted to fit this a couple of lines in here
uh,
from Evan Thompson's book Mind and Life, where he's talking about a critique of gene-centric biology, where the idea is like there's information in the gene and DNA molecules that codes for phenotypes. And
mm,
he critiques it, Thompson critiques that as a kind of Platonism
yeah,
in molecular biology. And I think it's like the opposite extreme of Platonism in biology from what Mike's trying to do, where instead of the information being in these DNA molecules, it's in this morphospace
yeah,
of predeterminate intellectual agencies of some kind. Um,
mm,
and so I think we want to find a way of talking about form that mediates between these two extremes. But this is Thompson, and it relates to the deconstruction point in an interesting way. So he says, this is page 182 for those
Mhm.
reading along at home. Information, he says, is not intrinsic to the linear array of the DNA sequence. Rather, it is constituted in and by the cell as an autopoietically organized three-dimensional entity, that is, by the cell as a body. By continuing to think in terms of the metaphor of information encoded in DNA, one forecloses the need to understand information as an emergent feature of the dynamic complexity of molecular and cellular processes and environmental processes. One genocentrist who addresses some of these critical points is Daniel Dennett. 1995, it's probably Darwin's dangerous idea. In his eyes, the critics of genocentrism are, quote, the deconstructionists of biology, elevating the reader, that is the code reading environment, to power by demoting the text, that is the genetic code. To which Dennett then replies, quote, it is a useful theme as an antidote to oversimplified gene centrism, but in overdose, it is about as silly as deconstructionism in literary studies. Oh.
Shots fired.
And then so Thompson continues, in his view, in Dennett's view, gene centrism, that is the doctrine that the DNA is the sole information store for inheritance, was always only a handy oversimplification because, of course, it is really only libraries plus readers that preserve and store information. Um, and so Dennett's always walking back his views in some places, even though in other places he makes the more forceful view, I think. But anyways, that idea that, not only is Dennett casting shade on literary deconstruction and the whole post-structuralist tradition in philosophy, as a Anglo-American analytic thinker himself, in more of Wittgenstein was important for him, so he's got some continental in there, but the analytics totally misunderstood Wittgenstein. Anyways, this idea of deconstruction, I think it's very helpful to understand what autopoietic theory and even just a evolutionary developmental approach to understanding biology does to this gene-centric view as, yeah, the equivalent of deconstruction in philosophy in biology, pointing out that any kind of essentialized idea of information or form is always missing context, always missing the role of history, contingency, and multiple forms of causality. And I think, I've said this to Mike in several of our conversations that one way of framing this that might be clarifying his project is that he's wanting to bring formal and final causality back into biology. And when we recognize that there are, in Aristotle's sense, and this is, I think, a helpful thing we can inherit from Aristotle, these four types of causality, not as Aristotle understood them in the hylomorphic way, but we can translate what Aristotle said about these four causes into Whitehead's terms,
Mm.
and then get a sense of the multiple things that are at play here and not end up doing another kind of reductionism where whether it's reducing all of the causal agency to the selfish genes or reducing all the causal agency to these Platonic forms, but recognize that are in the morphospace, we can recognize multiple forms of causality, right? That are operating materially in Whitehead's terms as creativity, that are operating in terms of the efficient cause as the way that the physical pole of an actual occasion inherits objective data from the past, and the formal cause is operating in the subjective form of the occasion, how it feels that past, and in terms of the mental pole considering all relevant alternatives or adjacent possibilities. And there's a final cause, which is this subjective aim, but also the initial aim, which is giving a relevance to that network of possibilities. And then there's this superject aspect of Whitehead's account of an actual occasion concressing, which is, I think, part of the final cause. Like the purpose of an organism is to understand teleology in nature, we can't think of the future causing the past. That's how
Mm.
teleology is often like interpreted, and I think that mixes things up. It's really about the present, in Whitehead's terms, is about the present dying to itself to affect the future.
Mm.
So there's the superjective nature of final causality implies that yes, there's purpose realized um, in nature, but it's always like as Derrida would say, like a purpose to come. It's like it's a gift to the future.
Mm.
Um, um, Hopefully that is comprehensible, but I think there's a way in which with Whitehead's account of concrescence, we get all the causes operating and we avoid um, the temptation of finding one cause to rule them all, whether the formal, uh, which
And not a,
yeah.
I'm not, and that is very, very lucid. And I'm discovering the limit of my stamina for these sorts of conversations this week because this is like
Oh
I've
yeah. Well,
had,
we've been going for 2 hours already, haven't we? So
yeah, but and I really want to do more justice to a lot of to a lot of these things than I feel like I'm capable of right now. But I think one of the analogs or complements to not searching for one cause to rule them all is also distinguishing between the way causes of this nature might be operative at local and global scales. And so, there is, I would always say purpose in biology, there is teleology in biology, or teleonomy if one prefers, because one is phobic of teleology. But it's pretty radically local, I would say, like this trait is absolutely for this particular thing, but because the cosmos as a whole is a radically frustrated many-body system, all of those directions are not unified except at the most kind of, abstract and almost trivial level. And so even you can apply that at all these different scales. So even if you were thinking about the purpose of an organism, okay, you might say that and you might be able to think of some candidates. But those things would both differ in time in ways that would be contradictory. So the purpose of the whole organismal system at this moment, when it's engaged in this task, might be quite different and even, in some way in tension between, and but then also the organism is a collective intelligence, and that even applies to a single cell, right? It's a frustrated many-body system. It's got lots of purposes in it, and we know various ways in which things can break down. But even when things are functioning about as well as they do, there's a lot of tension there and a lot of contradiction. And
right.
sometimes the complexity, certain aspects of the complexity of an organism evolve in response to an internal contradiction within the organism, and so I can give some examples of what, like negative synergy amongst toxins in a complex secretory mixture where, one toxin might exert an effect that if it exerts it too rapidly, it will actually block other toxins from being able to exert their effects. So then you need an additional molecule in the venom, which actually slows down the effect of that initial toxin. Or we see these phenomena of ontogenetic shifts where different purposes, different ecologies, basically different relational networks, that the organism is involved in at different times in their life require different phenotypes. Of course, this is, kind of extremized, not to make a pun about variational principles, but in, holometabolous insects and marine organisms and other things that have radically distinct life stages. But even in vertebrates and even in things like reptiles, where classically, one thinks of the juvenile as a little miniature version of the adult, and they're very precocial in this sense. They look like a fully developed snake comes out, looks like a fully developed snake in miniature, right? Quite different even from a human baby or the chicks of many birds, which are much more altricial, as we would say. But when you look under the hood, when you look at the thing physiologically or molecularly, it actually might be a very different organism at some other level of the phenotype. And so again, one of one of the things I've studied a lot in evolutionary toxinology is the ontogenetic shift in venom composition between baby brown snakes, members of the genus Pseudonaga, and adult brown snakes. And just to say that, there's a particular toxin that's in the venom of the adults and that is actually ancestral for we infer is ancestral for brown snakes and taipans, their closest relatives. So we infer an ancestral state of that whole brown snake taipan clade, which includes the expression of this particular toxin. It's a procoagulant hemotoxin. It causes blood to clot extremely rapidly. But one of the really fascinating things is that juvenile brown snakes do not produce this toxin. And they have a very different venom, actually, as it turns out, from the adult brown snakes. And this speaks to a kind of competition amongst toxins where at different life stages, different toxins all encoded by the same genome are more useful to the brown snake. And basically, I won't go into all the details, but basically the adult toxin composition would not serve the juvenile because the presence of this procoagulant toxin would actually block up, prevent the distribution of the neurotoxins, which are much more useful for the juvenile life stage. So all this is just to say, and maybe to put me in sort of an easy comfort zone where I can talk almost unconsciously about this stuff because I'm very tired, but is to say that these teloi, these purposes, are just radically multiple at all of these different levels, and so we encounter all kinds of conflict. And again, we could say that the existence of this ontogenetic shift, which requires distinct gene regulatory mechanisms to mediate it, is a complexification of the organism as a whole, right? It's now two different organisms at these two different life stages, but that complexification is driven by a tension in the kind of ancestral phenotype, by a conflict between the goals of different components. To jump from back to speculative ontology for a second, this question of agency, which has come up a bunch of times, and just to sort of reiterate something that I said really briefly in the chat with Robert and Mike, because Robert asked us at the end, where we see the agency, and Robert sees consciousness as fundamental, and so he's an idealist in this sense. And of course, we've talked a bit about Mike's view of the agency of the forms themselves. I just said in shorthand, I said, look, agency. The forms don't have agency, but agency requires form because agency requires organization. But the materials, but I also said I think it's kind of I don't know if category error is the right term, but I think to call what is most invariant in reality, as in what is most generic. So if we were talking about this kind of field, unstable field, blah blah blah, whatever that everything partakes in, or the plane of immanence, to call that matter or consciousness to me is a category error. To call it mind is a category error. To actually take any term from a kind of higher, element of reality and project it onto that is actually a kind of mysterianism in its sense. Like and particularly the way it's done in the contemporary philosophical landscape with the use of panpsychism. This is an issue for me. I think that is especially to the extent that it is specifically a response to the hard problem. It's an obscurantist move.
I mean, so long as we have people defending materialism, we're going to have people defending panpsychism.
No, sure, for sure. I just think that I think the real task, and I will pronounce on what the real is, and the idea, because I have access to the Platon. Anyway, to the ideal
task.
Yeah. But is the reconstruction of the ontology from brass tacks, without immediately, and even in light of Whitehead and the way he chooses to adopt certain terms. The reason I will not adopt them is because I have my own task of doing that thing, of doing that reconstruction. I can't start with God and mind and experience and those terms because frankly, they're just too loaded for me, because I want something more impoverished. Maybe I'm going to rediscover them. And I mean, I agree that his use of them is all legitimate. Like you can fully justify it, especially placing, as he does, contextualizing his own system in a history of the usage of these terms. So the adjacency relationships, are there again. Inheritance, blah blah blah. It's traditional, it's justified, and he does a wonderful job with it. But for me, I'm looking for something if it were metaphysics, precisely in the sense that Whitehead describes it, defines it, but if it's speculative ontology in general, I have a principle of impoverishment, as you know. And it's quite different, though, from the way Mike is characterizing the minimalism of, I mean, I am a kind of emergentist, obviously, but um, I'm not a minimalist in the sense that I'm trying to avoid the implications of some non-physical, aspect of reality. Again, I think kind of, you know, saying that reality is fundamentally physical. I mean, what does that even mean? Like it's kind of it's another kind of category error in a sense, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
could justify that kind of claim maybe, especially with what, that physics has done in the 20th century and all of that, but that's kind of destroyed the notion of what physics is in the classical sense
Mhm.
anyway.
Yeah.
Obviously, space-time, obviously classical physics can't be fundamental. So if that's what physicalism means, then of course one can't be a physicalist. So I'm not a minimalist in that sense, but I'm a minimalist in the sense that um, whatever unifies um, like the origins of structure in mathematics and the origins of structure in physical systems, let's say,
Mhm.
is, can't be reducible to either of those things because it is precisely where we discover the plane of immanence, which
Mhm.
is the kind of monism, but the monism of a multiplicity, the many one. I mean, we didn't get into, and I was hoping we were going to get into, but we're going to do the Timaeus in more detail, right? We will get into the Cora and the one and the Catherine Keller fusion of the plurisingular many one and that's quite Deleuzian. Keller is certainly she's very Whiteheadian, but I think a lot of the Whiteheadians that you like as well as I like, but Bradley, Stengers, Keller, they've all read their Deleuze, and so there is a Deleuzification of Whitehead that's read back onto Whitehead to some degree. We could, there are arguments that Whitehead was already there, maybe. Um, yeah, and look, the issues really do sprawl here.
Yeah.
But my view and the way the kind of the Cora and the one get fused, but is that agency or drive um, is basically tension, is basically fluctuation, is the Heraclitean fire, is the impossibility of stopping things from moving. That's drive. The thing is always going to move, is always going to differentiate itself. And agency is a result of the canalization of that drive. So you can't say that agency is on the side of the forms because the forms, I mean, as they are classically defined, and obviously Aristotle and onwards, but formal causation, they are the constraints. Now, of course, I agree with Mike. We discussed again yesterday, the constraint enablement thing, the constraint versus free lunch, etc. It's another false dichotomy. A constraint is an enablement. You must be constrained, and this is
Mhm.
totally the Platonic point about the forms anyway. And the claim there that in the Timaeus at least, and in the Phaedo and other places, that the material can't, Anaxagoras is such a silly person because he thinks the material can do it for himself, for itself, like can be self-constraining. No, we need external forms, etc.
Yeah.
Uh,
And Plato's saying that the demiurge is constrained by the forms,
yeah,
which are the model for how to shape the receptacle
well, he's constrained. He's actually dually constrained because he's constrained by the forms and he's constrained by
by
the
the
core.
receptacle too. Yeah,
Yeah,
by the aura. Yeah. I wanna
that. Yeah, go on. Yeah,
we're gonna talk about Timaeus next
yeah,
time, but we should wrap up. And I just wanted to clarify earlier that I wasn't wanting to accuse Mike of the kind of reductionism to all the agency being with the forms, because he does say, well, it's page 17 of at least the document. I don't know what it is in the preprint online, but he
yeah.
says he says that form and agential behavior are a combination of ingressing meaningful information patterns and physical constraints, and how they can manifest in the physical world determined by structural architecture, limitations of time and energy, and so on.
Mm.
So, he's clearly aware of the combination of factors here, and I didn't want to make it sound like I was accusing him of some sort of crass, idealist reductionism or something. Uh,
Yeah. And
But
he says that he wants a bidirectional, like he wants a counter-effectuationist kind of thesis.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I hopefully, if Mike's been listening, this has been helpful for him. The conversation will continue, and sometimes a lot of this stuff needs to be written out before we can arrive
Yeah.
at a shared understanding of it. But he
And
also,
I apologize. I don't think I've been very lucid today at all. And but this is just a beginning. I mean, it's an ongoing thing that we've been doing for years, but
not the beginning at all, but it's a continuation.
yeah.
Always to be continued. I did want to share the quote Mike has from Heraclitus. I'm not sure which fragment this is,
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's new to me. I'll have to track down this Heraclitus quote, and well, actually, before this gets published, I have to get the citation for it. But
Mm.
wisdom is one thing. It is to know the thought by which all things are steered through all things. So there's the cybernetic reference again that we started with, and wisdom is one thing. It is to know the thought by which all things are steered through all things. And I mean that's
That's
so
that's the logos that he's talking about. Yeah.
right,
Uh,
or the primordial nature of God in Whitehead's terms, which maybe Whitehead
well,
should use logos instead.
I,
So the
I'm trying.
thought is the translation for logos here. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to put them in, put it in Heraclitus's own terms. He's talking about the logos.
Right.
Yeah, I've got multiple translations of the fragments. I'm probably not going to find it. Because and they're all actually quite different as well as one would expect.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
Here's while cosmic wisdom understands all things are good and just, intelligence may find injustice here and justice somewhere else.
Mm.
Um, yeah, in the view from nowhere, is radically nominalist according to that view, right? All things are good and just. I think that's the radical view from radical acceptance, and that's
Mm.
also why it's so important. I mean, this is a very you know trying to make this connection on a very tiny thing, but it's very important to understand those physiologoi as sages, even though they are breaking from the model of the sage that came before them. It's a lived philosophy. Like these guys are like serious meditators. They're contemplative philosophers. And so when Heraclitus speaks about from the perspective of the cosmic wisdom, all things are good and just. He's talking about an experience that he has had, right? He's talking about an experience, like he's an empiricist about psychic reality in Jung's terms, as I think is Parmenides, and even though they seem to be radically opposed to each other, they so far as we know, but I think it's there in the texts even, they have these contemplative practices, and so they are radically empirical in the sense that Heidegger would say that these are the originary experiences from
Yeah.
which the history of metaphysics of Western metaphysics was birthed. And of course, you could say exactly the same thing about the Vedic philosophies in a very, very obvious way, that they're all contemplative philosophies with very strong practical components and actually worked out. The practical components tend to be worked out in much more detail than they were in the West. And I'm sure we can say this about all philosophy and obviously animism and all these sorts of things, that they come from a very, very close attention to lived experience and an attempt to generalize from that. And that's just all to say that we still need to be engaging in that kind of practice as well. Cue discussion of the triadic nature of reality and the prosaic, inquiry and speculative and things that we've talked about before, that just being a way to frame these things.
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
that,
And just to say, Plato also, I think, could be thought of as engaging in a kind of empiricism of ideas, in the sense that ideas are always a function of encounters, initiatory encounters, and a kind of rivalrous struggle, an agonist struggle, where there's he wrote dialogues because ideas um, manifest through this dialectical process, which is also a mythical process, because the human psyche is mythically structured. And when we try to find the originals, for these ideas, we end up bottoming out into a likely story, and not arriving at some sense of, a clear and distinct essence, even if we might have thought we were pointing towards one. So I think there's that the mention of the Platonic dialectic and dialogues as an encounter with ideas,
Mm.
I think makes it more experiential and emphasizes that this is also something that we're supposed to pursue uh, like as friends, and but as friendly enemies too. We want to test each other as we
Yeah.
pursue these ideas, and never let one of our interlocutors have it when there's clearly flaws in the argument. We got to keep the argument
There
going.
always there always will be, right? Exactly. And yeah, this is just in a modern, sort of deflationary sense. This is just the collegial nature of like scholarly criticism. But absolutely, yeah. We that contemplative frame, in a sense, that's partly there to differentiate ourselves from our own ideas as well, like so that we can stand back and observe them without being animated by them, as someone like Jung would say, right? Like, so the intrapsychic differentiation, which again is the ethical project of depth psychology, or of Jungian psychology, and maybe we don't want to conflate depth psychology with Jungian psychology, but um, that is an internal differentiation, which is a fine tuning of a frustration in this sense. It's saying there is all of this stuff going on in us, and we want to be capable of observing that, and so we can couple sparsely to it, as opposed to simply being thrown around and animated by it and getting upset when people don't agree with us, because ideally this dialogical format is precisely about us all benefiting from it, and us all growing through the critique, the critical engagement with our ideas. One thing I wanted to quickly jump back to, maybe as we can finish on this, but is this distinction that you mentioned between cosmology and metaphysics again, and we had a bit of a back and forth about this, and I'm going there now because you brought up the mythopoetic. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to say about information, and information always being mutual, and this again, relationships of adjacency, and all of that, and Simondon's reconceptualization of the nature of information, which I think is very, very insightful and crucial here. That's something that Jason and I will be developing in our paper on the frame problem. The Simondon one, which I think is the complement to our more Whiteheadian one. I mean, assuming they both go ahead, I think they'll go ahead regardless of whether they're in that special issue or not. But those guys said they were going to get back to me by today, so we shall see if that does indeed happen. But yeah, so there's a whole bunch of, as always, different threads to follow up on then, and I do agree with what Evan Thompson was saying in that quote that you read out. And Dennett is just a weird figure in a lot of ways, because he is extremely penetrating in his insight on a lot of issues, and then he does have but maybe we're all like this, he has these deeply entrenched blind spots. But his view also evolves, and I think there's heaps of juice in Darwin's Dangerous Idea. I think it's actually a really good book, but I think it's also a representation of a particular way of thinking about evolution, which was already, a little bit old hat at that time, but
Yeah.
still generalizations of it. And if you compare that with like From Bacteria to Bark and Back, there's quite a lot of development of the ideas. But bracketing all of those things, which would be great to continue talking about metaphysics and cosmology. And what I'd said to you in our exchange in WhatsApp about this was that I personally, so I have no issue with the mythopoetic, and I actually love it. And maybe we need almost more than a triad here when we're doing because there's this speculative thing. So there are different approaches to the speculative. If we have this Persian triad, which I'm not going to go into, but people need to watch our other videos, or we need to develop it again in another video. But the notion the speculative project, which is ontology, which is metaphysics, they come in there, whereas inquiry is more like science and other adjacent things, and the prosaic is basically the world of lived experience. And this, I said I wasn't going to explain it, but I'm not. But it maps in a sense on prosaic is a correlate of firstness, inquiry is a correlate of secondness, and the speculative is a correlate of thirdness in a certain important way. Anyway, there are different approaches, of course, within each of those. So those are themselves very, plural. And within the speculative, we can think about this mythopoetic approach, and I'm into that, I think, and we need to. But there's also something that Plato himself sort of inaugurates, but which is also very characteristic of modern metaphysics, and Kant, well, Descartes, obviously, and Kant, and Leibniz, and one could list the names, but deepens or pursues that approach, which is more the kind of logical approach, the sort of logico-mathematical approach to the speculative, and so looking for kind of abstract invariants, abstract functions, which again are they're invariant across all the more concrete domains of reality. Like, so in a way you would be looking at principles of emergence of discrete definite structure in mathematics and in physics, and this approach would sort of unify those things, even though I've said it's a kind of more mathematical approach. But Poincaré says as well, mathematicians do not study objects but relations between objects. So he's like a proto category theorist in that sense, as is Whitehead, obviously, a bit later. And thus they are free to replace some objects by others, so long as the relations remain unchanged. And so there's that where we don't. So in Plato, you have the fusion, because he's also developing this, but the fusion of the conceptual personae with the operators. So his logical operators in his cosmology are also simultaneously kind of conceptual personae, like they are figured in a kind of mythopoetic language. And I think that's still something that we can do. And obviously, Whitehead is trying to do both of these things to the hilt. And that's why, obviously, he has this incredible logical edifice, which is his metaphysical scheme, or his cosmology, if you want. And then he has the mythopoetic aspect. And you had sort of implied that in fact that division tracks the distinction between cosmology and metaphysics, that metaphysics would always go into the mythopoetic. And I'm not sure about that. Like, or I don't want to affirm that. Maybe you don't, now that I'm saying it in this way, but I don't want to affirm that now. I want to say that
Yeah.
mythopoetic approach, there's a more sort of logical or mathematical approach. And these are intimately related, and historically they were the same, but they have been increasingly differentiated. And that has been a very problematic history, of course. That's part of the history of modern science, and the mechanical philosophy itself is a rigorous attempt to distinguish those sorts of things that in many ways goes horribly wrong. And we'll talk about this with the Timaeus, and we'll talk about necessity, which you brought up earlier, and the way that the mechanical philosophy gets necessity completely wrong from the Platonic side of things, for example, right? And it does this by collapsing all of the operators in a very problematic way. And for example, preserving the function of the omnipotent, omniscient deity whilst excising the mythopoetic figure, excising the personage, and collapsing that function onto the materials themselves, and thereby coming up with a very, very sort of bastardized notion of necessity, aka determinism, in comparison with necessity in the Timaeus is actually more like stochasticity for us.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite.
So it's fascinating how that history goes. But yeah, I just wanted to flag that I'm
Yeah.
seeing mythopoetic and the more abstract, if you want, the diagrammatic. I want to call it the diagrammatic. That's what I want to call it. I don't want to call it mathematical as such, even though that,
That's
you know,
good.
yeah, I want to call it diagrammatic, and I want to say that where Peirce says that the diagrammatic operation, the pursuit of a diagrammatic method, is stripping the garb from things, such that
Right.
the functions and relations are more starkly revealed, such that we can see them in themselves. And so this
Right.
is what I want to say. I want to say that move, that diagrammatic move, is incredibly important. And when I speak about impoverishment in the speculative, I'm talking about that. I'm talking about making a clear distinction. Well, I'm also talking about minimizing our set of operators, right? But
Yeah.
I'm also saying that that minimal set of operators should be a diagram. And then we can also speak mythopoetically about that, but that is a different project and it
Yeah.
satisfies something different in us.
I totally agree with all of that. I don't remember what I may have said in WhatsApp about the cosmology metaphysics distinction in that context, but I would almost say the logical mathematical or the diagrammatic is the metaphysical, whereas the mythopoeic is the cosmological, in the sense that the cosmological is the account of actual history, including the formation, the cosmogenesis, and the history of human consciousness, and all the archetypal accretion and sedimentation that structures our capacity to think and feel and will and imagine. When we do cosmology, we're always beginning with that history as constraining our thought. And so we're in that cosmological condition always, I think, going to need to do mythopoeia. And like evolution is relevant um cosmologically because it's got a narrative, it's a narrative structure, like it's a narrative logic if you want, but
Also,
metaphysics is something else where we're trying to say, yeah, strip it bare. What's the condition of possibility of any of that sort of cosmic history? And that'll always be transcendental. Like we approach that at the horizon, and you can never arrive. So
but also we're reading that and it's importantly, and for me, for I think for a processual approach, it's an operational schema,
yeah,
not a figuring of objects or structures. It's relations, not terms, at the barest minimum. And whilst we're also kind of asymptotically approaching that as an ideal from, and it's always in some sense beyond the horizon, we're reading it off the horizon, right?
yeah,
Like our best attempt to figure it is a kind of that's the relationship that we're in with that horizon, and that then does have its direct analogy in an actual evolutionary historical concept, like context, like obviously in cosmology the singularity, but like as I say all the time, the way ancestral states just always recede across horizons. You can
yeah,
never, and part of that again for whatever we're figuring as this minimal operational schema is that there is some irreducible contingency baked into things. So there is a kind of there's a role for the receptacle, there's a role for chaos, for the stochastic in birthing contingent histories, and that means those histories are themselves, again, we talked about broken symmetries last week. They are irreducible. There's an irreducible level of contingency. You'll never completely explain even cosmology, right? Even a cosmic history, or even even a personal history. Like that principle applies at all these different levels. Um,
yeah. Um, Last thing I want to say about this, and then we'll call it quits for tonight or today for you. But is that, there's these aren't totally separate, um, the metaphysical and cosmological, obviously. And for Whitehead and I think for Peirce, when they're doing metaphysics, the divine function is for them a kind of it becomes a logical operator that they couldn't avoid. And it's distinct from any role that God might play mythically or cosmologically or religiously, where all of a sudden that divine function, um, as we would call it in a metaphysical register, becomes an object of religious devotion and emotion and all these things that we clothe it with. Um, I think the ideal relationship between metaphysics and cosmology or myth or theology or religion would be where there's a mutual informing going on, but like if we take Whitehead at his word or Peirce at his word or Aristotle at his word, like they don't they're not imagining a divine function in order to satisfy some religious longing. They're doing it because they think it's how we make sense of reality, that there's some logical need for it. Um,
I
and
wonder if I wonder if we can say that equally about each of those personages, um, given what we know of their biographies. And maybe
We could
that's not true.
psychoanalyze them. Russell psychoanalyzed Whitehead and said he only had God because his son died in the war and he was sad about it. And
Mm.
for sure we could do that.
Because I
Uh,
think there is still this distinct. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying, but there is still this distinction. Like as soon as we put the name on it,
yeah,
we put the garb on it. We
right.
put the garb on it. When we reach into the mythopoetic for
Yeah,
the traditional name of that function, or even call it the divine function, which I think is what you were implying just then. We're bringing that into we're bringing them together, and I mean that's fine. And it's just that we need to be clear that that's what we're doing. And Peirce's neglected argument is one of the most beautiful examples of this. That is a way that he is trying to integrate his speculative ontology, obviously his logic, his belief that being should be figured logically, but it should be obviously a dynamic conception, with his lived experience, and the way and his neglected argument is about like calling it God and emphasizing its goodness and tying it to this somewhat mysterious. So this is another thing that I wanted to talk about tension and adjacency and abduction, which we'll get back to another time. But tying it to this somewhat mysterious function of abduction and the fact that we're able to orient ourselves in a more or less spontaneous way. When he's putting all of those sorts of things together, it's in light of the neglected argument, which, as we recall, is supposed to be about the way that it feeds back on one's behavior, and so it is an ethical
right.
way of bringing these different things together, but that's very personal, obviously, and so that is going to, I think it's a beautiful argument, and I think it's as good an argument as any, and it's an entirely justifiable reason to bring those two conceptions together at that level, the
Yeah.
mythopoetic and the diagrammatic, and how they fuse together in lived experience. And in fact,
There are no free floating disembodied logicians. Only persons can be logicians, so there's this, you could say that taints the logic, but you could also
no,
say
that's
it
that's the
makes the
that's the
logic possible.
exactly, because that's the dependence of the logic on the actual, and that's the adjacency thesis that I really want. And I mean, it's Whitehead's ontological principle.
But it
Um,
also leaves, I mean, a AI um, booster could say, well, we could have a disembodied logician if, we get AGI and,
but this is a complete misapprehension.
mhm.
Go down to, I'm very tired, so if I I say it too emphatically. Um, Algorithms are not disembodied when they are being run in computers. The body is quite different, but that is a physical system, and the laws of computation are physical laws, right? I mean, David Deutsch is actually really nice on the way he talks about this, but that is a physically instantiated system, and its
Mhm.
degrees of freedom are predicated on a very specific kind of physical embodiment. And I completely agree with Mike, obviously, that those degrees of freedom often exceed our expectations of them, and it's very interesting what they can do.
Yeah.
It's not it's a thesis about actualization. As that algorithm runs, it is actualizing physical states of affairs in the guts of the computer
Well,
itself.
it's actualized as physical states of affairs, but I think the process of actualization includes something like a dipping into a space of possibility as well. And the question is, the current instantiation of computers do that? Do you need quantum computers to do that? Or is it only organisms that have that capacity right now? And I think Mike would say we don't want to limit it to just organisms that can dip into that field of possibility. But it could be the current architectures don't allow computers to do that.
Yeah,
Uh,
but I would agree with that. And I mean, just as a base, if we were diagramming again, and you can talk about whether this is embodied or disembodied, but as soon as you create, arrange a determinate operational schema, not necessarily now the most generic one for the cosmos or the metaphysics, but that is a program. Um, it's a set of logical operations. It immediately exists in an adjacency relationship with a bunch of things that are yet to be realized. Just as soon as you have a protein scaffold, you can imagine, and this is like very key to molecular evolution of proteins. You've got a stable protein scaffold. You've got all these surface residues that are more, the variation of that subset of surface residues, which is not integral to the structural core of the scaffold, so that can change without the whole thing falling apart. Those variations are immediately brought into a kind of state of quasi-definiteness in correlation to the actualization of that protein scaffold itself.
Right.
That's a basic kind of diagrammatic principle. You've got a set of parameters. The variation of those parameters is already,
Yeah.
adjacent to
This
them.
is this is akin to the question answer complex, right? That
Mm.
already contained in a question is a certain, array of answers. And so really you want to focus on how you frame the question.
Yeah, yeah. So now we're back in our Bergson, Simondon,
Mm,
Deleuze conceptualization of the history of philosophy. And again, what Deleuze says in 66 about Simondon, even relative to Deleuze, to Bergson, who obviously they were both influenced by,
right.
but Deleuze knew his Bergson very well. Simondon gives us a novel conception of the problematic because
Yeah.
he defines it in terms of the tensed unity, the more than a unity, of a fluctuating field as
Mm,
itself a problematic, and the ongoing problematic and its contingent but never final resolution in the individuation process. The determinate individual arising as a kind of contingent preliminary resolution to some particular sub-problematic in a certain sense, but bringing the problematic nature of the pre-individual itself along with it. And that is so fundamental to the way Deleuze writes in Difference and Repetition. And so, yeah, I love that you have brought us there, and I want to give you the last word. I'm so bad. I'm always like, I have something else to say.
I've been doing
But
it too.
I think that's a really, really nice place to end up.
Yeah.
Because yeah, the intrinsically problematic nature of a field of pure difference, of primary difference, basically, is in fact what begins this whole journey in some sense, right?
All right. Um, it's probably enough for tonight. This was a lot of fun. I'm going to I'll try to make a transcript of this just so that for Mike and whoever else wants to
Yeah,
view it.
make sure GPT
I'll
doesn't
I'll share it with you first.
misrepresent me.
Yeah. We can, yeah, we'll go over it first to make sure it's accurate.
Yeah, awesome.
I
And I
always
mean,
read I always read through it when I share transcripts, but I don't know what you said as well as I know what I said. So
yeah, well, of course, for sure, for sure. And I mean, it's not a big deal in the end of the day, and I can always point to the actual conversation. But there was a little bit of a faux pas on GPT's part when it transcribed.
consequential word swap. Yeah.
Very consequential word swap. Um, yeah, no, this is great, and I do think even though this is not a beginning, it's preliminary in terms of our engagement with Mike's research program here. And so if Mike does make it to this point of the video, that's what I'd want to say. I don't think we've resolved anything or like, given you the right terminology or something like that, but this is ongoing. Even our Platonic dialogues are going to continue for the next few. I think we meet again in a fortnight though. I'm just a bit overloaded at the moment and I've got to go.
Fine with me. So am I. It sounds good.
Um, and I think a key thing that we didn't touch on here, but I did mention in the dialogue with Mike and Robert, is the Timaeus Parmenides relationship.
Mhm.
Because the Parmenides is where we get the one and all of that, right? Um, so yeah, we will continue this obviously ad infinitum. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Tim.
All right, man.
Always fun. See you in a couple weeks, but I'm sure we'll keep
Oh
hammering
yeah,
on WhatsApp. So
for sure, man. Yeah.
take care. Hope you get
Take
caught
care.
up on things.
Yeah. You too.